welcome. I'm Dorothea from Moscow, one of the owners here at Labyrinth, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's discussion with Fintan O'Toole in celebration of his wonderful new book, We Don't Know Ourselves, A Personal History of Modern Ireland. Here it is. So quickly, some housekeeping notes. These will be familiar for many of you. Thank you, first of all, for keeping your masks on still. There's an uptick in cases, and we try to set our policy to protect the most vulnerable in the community. Thank you for that. For those of you watching online, know that you can add your questions to the QA function at the bottom of your screen, so we can include those in the QA portion of tonight's event. We're going to leave time for everyone's questions in the room and online. And then a shout out to our co-sponsors for tonight's event, and those are the Humanities Council at Princeton University and the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University. But on to our distinguished guest and his book. Fintan O'Toole is a commentator and writer for the Irish Times and the Guardian, and we all know him too as a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and a professor at the Lewis Center for the Arts here in Princeton. The most recent of his many celebrated books are Modern Ireland in 100 Artworks, Judging Shaw, and then The Politics of Pain, Post-War England and the Rise of Nationalism, which we celebrated together here when it came out in 2019. So, We Don't Know Ourselves. The double entendre of the title of this intimately narrated history of modern Ireland clues us into what becomes a story of a nation coming by slow and painful fits and starts and setbacks out of decades of cognitive dissonance, of violence enabled by hypocrisies, of feigned ignorance, and a way of being out of step with itself, coming out of all of this into a moment of genuinely transforming self-understanding. A lot of the story has, maybe not so surprisingly, to do with the Catholic Church, with nationalism and civil strife, with the staggering exodus of the Irish from Ireland, and with an ambiguous relationship to modernization itself. What is surprising, so surprising, is how, as Colin McCann put it in his glowing review in the New York Times book review, which you maybe saw, he said, Fintan, and I quote, weaves the flag rather than waving it. For this, he has invented a kind of national history anchored in the intimate personal vignette, in the autobiographical snapshot. It's this method, I think, that allows us to see the complex density of history of a moment like the following in 1970. Some courageous women take a train north to buy contraceptives and make a show of declaring these at customs on the way back, having substituted aspirin for the pill since they didn't know they needed a prescription for the pill. The customs officials pretend they don't see anything. It's not clear what there is to see. And this stunt is going on just at the very beginning of the Troubles. The key is how in this moment, as Fintan writes, and I quote, something big was simultaneously happening and not happening. Several big things, in fact, which is just to say that we as readers don't just come to know something about Ireland through this book, but are taught a way of knowing Ireland as it's getting to know itself between 1958 and today. We're in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Fintan O'Toole.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much in particular to those of you who have heroically braved thunder, lightning, flood, fire, storm to get here. And also thank you very much to everybody who's joining us online. Thank you, Dorothea, for hosting the event, of course, but also for that wonderfully eloquent introduction. I've never had one, I think, as concise and illuminating as that. It says a lot of things much better than I say them myself, so everything else is going to be downhill really after that. I thought, if you don't mind, I might just give you some sense of the way the book works just by reading a short part of it. I couldn't really properly write the book until I had a subtitle, because I didn't know what the form of the book was. It's not a usual form. My life's too boring for a memoir, really, and I'm not a historian, and anyway, there are terrific books about the modernization of Ireland written by historians using archives. And what I wanted to write was sort of something that got you into the texture of fundamental change and how that change felt and how it unfolded. In a place which is sort of microcosmic, Irish people are absolutely fascinated by Ireland, unsurprisingly. But I would suggest that maybe Ireland is interesting for other reasons, which is that it's such a small place and it concentrates in this very tiny part of the world. A lot of the larger forces that are at work around colonialism, decolonization, around modernization, whatever that means, about globalization, all the questions about gender and power are very, very concentrated in the Irish story. So I wanted to try and tell it as a story, as it were. I eventually, satisfied myself that I came up with the phrase personal history, which sounds very arrogant and overbearing in terms of, who are you to have a personal history of Ireland? But I sort of thought about it as the kind of book that anybody could write about their own country in a way. All of us, we're all kind of Forrest Gumps or Zelligs, in some ways. Like, history does cross our paths in all sorts of different ways. So this is just the beginning of a chapter, which is really about Ireland beginning to think of itself on a world stage. Right? So this is coming up to the time when a very momentous decision is made for Ireland to join the European Union, which is really a kind of key moment in Irish history. But that in turn kind of raises all sorts of questions about identity and belonging and history, and forces Ireland also to think about its diaspora, the fact that it's a culture constituted by mass emigration, and is it in that sense even a European country? Because of course so much of that immigration was to America. And all these questions about identity and race, belonging and history are raised in this little vignette from my life and my father's life. My father worked on the Dublin bus system, the public transport system, as a bus conductor, which is itself a kind of nostalgic term now. I don't think there are any bus conductors anywhere left in the world. In July 1972, my father was working on an early morning bus that went out the quiet roads into the foothills of the Dublin mountains. It was trundling along outside Enniskerry when he saw a very unusual sight for those times in Ireland. A group of men running along the side of the road in tracksuits. They were big men. They were also black men. One of them was the person my father most adored in the whole world. The bus pulled up ahead of the group and my father jumped off to say hello to Muhammad Ali. He was in Dublin for a fight in Croke Park against Al Blue Lewis. My father asked Ali if he would like a lift. Ali joked that he had left his wallet in his hotel and couldn't pay the fare. My father said he would make an exception for Ali and his entourage. They got on the bus and Ali said good morning to the few sleepy passengers, then got off and continued his training run. When he was telling us about this magical encounter, my father kept using the word beautiful about Ali, the first time I had ever heard a man use it about another man. This was the most exotic thing that had ever happened to any of us. But for the Americans who came with the boxers, Ireland was disappointingly unexotic. Diane Lewis, the girlfriend of Blue Lewis's trainer, Don Elbaum, and a professional dancer in Las Vegas, explained that prior to her arrival in Dublin, she had imagined Ireland to be full of cottages surrounded by fields. I was absolutely amazed at your hotels. I never dreamed you would have lifts. In fact, I was quite disappointed when I discovered I would not have to ascend long wooden staircases leading on to some rafter-type apartments. I reckoned on hotels being similar to enlarged farmhouses with not another building in sight. Ali himself, however, had a more serious interest in Ireland. He made it clear that apart from winning the fight, his main ambition was, quote, to meet Miss Bernadette Devlin. Bernadette Devlin was an extraordinary young woman who had become pretty much the leader of kind of militant Irish nationalism in Northern Ireland. Contemporary quote says, Ali wants to have a long talk with the Mid-Ulster MP and hopes to put a series of penetrating questions to her about her role in politics, her philosophy, and the things she's trying to achieve in public life. He admires her very much. Devlin did in fact visit Ali's camp and have dinner with him. She would later recall that even in the middle of a violent conflict, this fact was much more important to her constituents than anything else she had done. None of the other famous people I met impressed my constituents at all, but they were all nearly shaking my hand after that, not because I'd gone through hell for them, but because mine was the hand that had shaken the hand of Muhammad Ali. She would also confess late in life that she could recall relatively little about some of the dramatic moments of her political career, but Ali I remember vividly. My father had also shaken the hand of the great man, and even vicariously, the idea of being associated with him was thrilling. So Ireland as a whole decided to take possession of Muhammad Ali. During that visit, it was revealed that Ali's maternal great-grandfather, Abe Grady, was an O'Grady from County Clare. The local newspaper, the Limerick Leader, reported that today there's many an O'Grady from Clare who regard Muhammad Ali as one of their own. But it also reminded its readers of equally famous members of the O'Grady clan. Stanislas O'Grady was the founder and first master of the Clare Hunt. Sean O'Grady in the 1940s was prominent in government circles. And of course, O'Grady the poet was renowned during the era of the famed Bardic School in the Burren. Placing Muhammad Ali on the same familial roll of honour as O'Grady, the Member of Parliament in the 1940s, was at one level just the usual Irish impulse of elevation by association, not fundamentally different from the absorption of John F. Kennedy as one of our own. Except, of course, that Ali had changed his name precisely to reject the history of slavery encoded within it. For Ali, this was a sore subject. He was acutely aware of the racist narrative in which his white blood could be used to explain away his greatness. He also presumed that this part of his ancestry was rooted in coercion. He told RTE, the Irish National Television Station, that, quote, the Irish have names like O'Connor and Grady and Kennedy. Africans have names like Lumumba and Nkrumah. We have names like Grady and Clay and Hawkins and Smith and Jones and Johnson, but we're black. The Grady part of his heritage, in fact, contained a more complex history than he knew at the time. Abe Grady was not a slave owner. He married an emancipated African-American woman in Kentucky. And while the insistence of journalists on asking him questions about his Irish roots threatened to ignite Ali's anger, he defused a possible row with a graceful dismissal. You never can tell. There was a lot of sneaking around in that business. There was no better way to shut down a controversy in Ireland than by hinting that if you really wanted to talk about it, you would have to talk about sex. So, I suppose when I started writing this book, I was in a way kind of trying to answer a question that I hadn't really properly framed for myself. And the question really was, why did a certain version of Ireland, which seemed absolutely impregnable for most of my lifetime, collapse so quickly? It's not, why did it change? Everywhere changes. And the kind of Ireland that I was born into in the 1950s was literally unsustainable for reasons I'll talk about. But what's fascinating is that Ireland seemed to last for an incredibly long time and then to go very thoroughly and very quickly. It's now pretty much disappeared. And the answer to those kinds of questions, like why did the Soviet Union collapse so quickly? Why do systems that seem to be so commanding in their power, how is it possible for them to vanish almost overnight? And the answer to that question is usually that maybe they were not what they seemed in the first place. That maybe the reality they had created was actually much more of a front than it seemed to be while we were living through that reality. And I think the story that I ended up trying to tell really is about the way that there were three big things that kind of shaped Ireland. And each one of them had a sort of shadow self, or had a kind of doubleness implicit in it that we were living with all the time without acknowledging. And in a way, what happened was that the shadow self kind of just moved in and shunted out the reality we thought we had. The first of those strangenesses was the big fact of demography. I mean, the thing that you can never really deny about any country is the population, the size of the population. And the demography of Ireland is not like anywhere else I know. I mean, I don't know of any other country as a whole whose population is still lower right now than it was in 1840. It's a strange phenomenon. It's possible that in 1840, the population of the island of Ireland was 8.5 million. It's on current projections. It's possible that the island as a whole, Northern Ireland plus the Republic, might be back to 8.5 million in 2040, 200 years later. So demography is reality, and by the time I was born, the population of the Republic of Ireland, which is the 26 counties, the majority of the island, had dipped below 3 million. It was bleeding away. This was a place that was itself sort of on the cusp of vanishing. There was a book that came out a couple of years before I was born called The Vanishing Irish, edited by an American Jesuit, a very kind of serious sociological, cultural study saying there may be nobody left at all by the year 2000. There's a cartoon that was on the front of the Irish Times. The Abbey Theatre in Dublin used to run an annual playwriting competition. And in, I think, 1956, they didn't award the prize. And there was a cartoon of two bohemian intellectuals, presumably playwrights, male playwrights, identified by the fact they had beards. Obviously, they were kind of a bit weird and writing plays. And one of them was saying to the other, he's saying, I was very disappointed my play didn't win the Abbey competition. And he was saying, oh, what was it? He said, oh, it was a dramatization of The Vanishing Irish. It was just an empty stage. Like Samuel Beckett didn't come from nowhere. The sense of disappearance, of ebbing away is incredibly strong. And it wasn't abstract. It was very real. So, over half of the people born in the country at the time, so Ireland is 100 years old now. So, this time it was only 30, 35 years old. Half the people born in the place had left. And there were two countries in Europe that lost population in the 1950s. The 50s, if you think, was as in America, the baby boom. But in Europe, it's this kind of frantic repopulating of society almost. This sort of almost visceral urge to, replace the catastrophic dead of the war and Holocaust. So babies are being born all over the place, and it's a great period of economic renewal and rebuilding. And just two countries in Europe lost population. One was East Germany, for kind of obvious reasons, before the building of the wall, and the other one was Ireland. And Ireland couldn't build a wall. You know, you couldn't actually build a wall around Hooker. They would have done it if they could, by the way. You know, they just couldn't. And so this had a huge psychological effect, really, which was a revolution from above. The revolution from below was people voting with their feet. They got out. You know, they didn't believe in the possibility of real political change at home, so they just left, particularly young people, and particularly women. One of the unusual things about Irish migration, as well as its extent, was that it was one of the very few kind of mass migrations which was majority female. And there were, you know, very good reasons for that. Young women didn't want to stay in Ireland. So that kind of the future, the fertility of the country was leaving, if you know what I mean. And, you know, that psychologically it felt like those are the women who are going to have Irish babies in the future, but they won't be having them in Ireland. They'll be having them in Brooklyn or in Boston or in London or in Glasgow. And of course, the particular humiliation was that in the 50s, the majority of the emigration was to England, to Scotland. So it wasn't just that you were emigrating, it was that you were emigrating back to the country that you had fought for hundreds of years to leave. So this led to a kind of revolution from above, which was a very small number of people, and really primarily one senior civil servant, a man called T.K. Whitaker, published an extraordinary document in the year I was born. So this is why I'm linking my own life history to this revolution, because I just happened to be born at the time of this extraordinary document. And it has the most boring possible name. It's called Economic Development. And it was published with no, you know, it just has, you know, no illustration on the cover. It's kind of a grey book. And even at the time, a lot of people didn't pay very much attention to it. It was kind of but it's a very interesting document. And it was basically saying the game's up. This whole thing we suffered for, you know, to create our own state, it's really not viable unless we change radically. And in a way, this was sort of, you have to understand that it was a kind of conservative impulse in the proper sense, right, which was. Also in 1958 was published one of the great novels, Giuseppe de Lampedusa's The Leopard, you know, and it has that famous line in The Leopard where it's set during the time of the Risorgimento in Italy, and the young guy runs off to join the revolutionaries, and his uncle, who's the Duke, is kind of horrified. And the young guy says to the Duke, he says, but what you've got to understand is that in order for things to stay the same, things have to change. You know? And that was very much the spirit of this kind of revolution from above in Ireland. In order to have an Ireland that we can protect and keep and try to keep the values that we want, particularly Catholicism, we have to change. We have to change radically economically. And to do this by importing capital. So in a way, what they were trying to do was to reverse the historic process. So Irish labour had gone to American capital. And now, you know, could we reverse it? Could we bring American capital to Irish labour? Could you induce companies, well, American, but also German, British, anybody really, anybody wants to come, set up a factory in Ireland. We'll give you, you know, pretty much tax-free for 10 years. Ireland had very cheap labour. That was one of the attractions too. But this, of course, was abandoning what Ireland was supposed to be like, right? So the ideal, the nationalist ideal, was it was rural, it was agricultural, you know, it was simple, a peasant society, which held on to these very special Catholic virtues. So it was kind of abandoning that, and it was taking this gamble, right? It was sort of taking a gamble that Karl Marx was really wrong about everything, right? That you could change the economy and it wouldn't change the culture or the politics. You know, everything would kind of stay the same. And it was a gamble that actually turned out for a very long time to be, to look like it was a winning bet. Because actually a lot of Ireland in terms of values and in terms of politics, in terms of the way the society worked, remained remarkably stable during this social revolution. So you're moving people from the countryside into the cities, you're moving the economy from being a cattle-dominated rural economy to being an industrial economy. And you're moving Ireland's place in the world from being this kind of complete backwater, right, to becoming more and more globalized, more integrated into the global economy. you're doing all of that, and actually, oddly, one of the stories I was trying to tell in the book is that really you could argue for almost up to the end of the 20th century, Catholic Church is still incredibly powerful. The same political party is still governing the country. A lot of the ways in which the place works remained unchanged. And so that's the first kind of thing you have to explain, right? Which is what was going on there. How could you change somewhere so radically and not have the place collapse and fall down, and not have the system, this system which was this fusion of Catholicism and nationalism that made up Irish identity? How could you not have that collapse suddenly for all that long period of time? And the reason, I think, is that Irish people have become incredibly adept at living in two worlds at the same time. And they become adept, not because we're, obviously the most brilliant people on earth, but, simply because mass migration. Mass migration means that people for a long time, for generation after generation, have been living in a physical Ireland and in the Ireland of family, the Ireland of who were, where were your kids? Your kids were in Boston. You were raising children to emigrate, and so that doubleness, and what that meant was, of course, that modernity was not new to Irish people. It was new to Ireland as a place. You had this disjunction between people and place. They did not cohere. So where did Irish people go? They went to some of the biggest cities, most developed cities in the world, right? I mean, when Irish people emigrated to America, they mostly didn't go to Ohio, they didn't go to Wyoming, they went to New York, to Boston, to Chicago, to these places that were on the cusp of modernity, the leading edge. So Irish people had been modernizing themselves for a very long time. What was happening in Ireland was, in a way, that was being repatriated. But it wasn't psychologically or culturally all that new. And so that this sort of demographic paradox, I think, was one of the things that's going on. In a way, what had been going on was this strangeness, right? Which was that in order to maintain one of the most apparently conservative societies in the world, the people in that society had to be incredibly radical. And that might sound like it doesn't make any sense. What I mean by this is that to maintain a facade of Holy Catholic Ireland, which was mostly rural and mostly about raising cattle, how could you do that? You could only do it at the expense of the people, the citizens, having to take the most radical decisions, which is to go from a 20-acre farm in Mayo to New York. So the stability of the state was founded on the disruptive activity of the population. And this is a paradox. But that also means that the stability is a funny kind of stability. It's not what it looks like. So that was really the first element of this. The second element, the second thing that wasn't quite what it seemed, was Catholicism. So the state that was founded 100 years ago was really founded on this fusion of religion and politics. So political identity and religious identity were, by and large, one thing. So the Ireland I was born into was overwhelmingly Catholic. This was, in a way, not entirely the fault of Irish Catholicism or nationalism. It was, in part, a large part, of course, a result of partition. If you partition an island and you say, well, that bit's Protestant, that bit's Catholic, what you get is that each part of that then become kind of they become hyper-Protestant, oppressing their Catholic minorities, which happened in the north, but also the south becomes kind of hyper-Catholic. It says, well, we don't really have to worry about diversity or plurality or all those kinds of things that other places have to worry, because we're all Catholics, we're all white Catholics. I mean, well over 90% of the population was Catholic. And it's not just that we're all Catholic, but like well over 90% of the population was like seriously practicing Catholic. I mean, people who went to mass at least once a week, who went to confession, who got the sacraments, and who obeyed the church, who did what they were supposed to do. And particularly women did this in relation to their sexuality. So the church was incredibly powerful. The church pre-existed the state for a very long time, and for historical reasons, the church had come to be a repository of Irish national identity. Parallel to this would be, if you think about Poland, for example. When Poland was kind of obliterated, the church became, in a way, the institution that held on to a sense of Polish identity. When Irish identity was obliterated in many ways by the British, the church kind of played that role. So it was in this position when the state was founded to set the terms for how politics worked, for how social life worked, for how pretty much everything worked. This meant, for example, divorce was not just illegal, it was unconstitutional. There was a clause in the Constitution saying, no law will ever be passed in Ireland to allow for divorce. It meant that contraception was illegal. Dorothea mentioned the wonderful women who went up to Belfast to buy contraceptives, as a gesture of revolt. But right up into the 1980s, contraceptives were illegal. It meant that the laws that were used to persecute and prosecute Oscar Wilde in the 1890s in Britain were still in force in Ireland in the 1990s, early 1990s. So it meant that the church had this kind of stranglehold on all legislation that dealt with sexuality and with women and children in particular. And why do I say this was double? It looks like the most monolithic single thing. You recently say, come on, give us a break. This is a really repressive, very powerful system that people really didn't defy openly very much. And if they did, they were punished for it. But the reason I say that it was double was that, of course, it was any sort of hyper identity can never be real. Nobody lives like that. And I'm not talking about religion or religious faith. I'm talking about the imposition of religion as politics, as power, as temporal power, governing what you can and can't do. Did this mean that Irish people, were in fact the holiest people in the world and behaved entirely as they were supposed to behave? Well, we know they didn't. And the reason we know it is very, very dark. The reason we know it is because people have to be terrified into behaving themselves. I mentioned in the book that there were two words that I don't remember not knowing, if you know what I mean. I don't remember ever learning them. I've known them as long as I have memory. And one of those words was letterfrack, and the other word was dangan. And these were place names, but they were the place names of the two most notorious, what were so-called industrial schools. And these were horrific places in which little children were locked up and horrifically abused by the religious orders who ran these institutions. So this sort of institutional terror existed very powerfully within the society. And it was there for children, and it was in particular there for women. So you had this archipelago, really, of institutions, the industrial schools for children, the Magdalen laundries, which were, you may have heard of them, they were institutions in which young women who were thought to be in moral danger or should be presenting a moral danger to others were basically just kidnapped, taken away from their families, incarcerated, and made to perform slave labor. They were unpaid labor for as long as they were there. They had to work these were laundries, they were commercial laundries. That was the second part of this institutional archipelago, and the third part was so-called mother and baby homes. So if a young woman became pregnant out of marriage, usually if she could, if she had any resources or friends, she got to England. English social workers had a code which they used on their case records, which was PFI, so for pregnant from Ireland. But if you couldn't get away, if you couldn't escape, you were put in a mother and baby home. And a mother and baby home is where you you saw out your pregnancy and you had your baby, you were given a false identity so that nobody would know the shame of this. And then that baby, you know, a couple of days after you gave birth, you were told to sign some forms. And this was adoption. You were giving up your baby, whether you really knew it or like, you know. This is a story which is still unfolding. Because of course things like birth certificates were often fraudulently, you know, altered. So the mother's names were excluded. You could buy a baby in, you know, when I was born in 58 and for quite a while afterwards, if you were an American Catholic couple who wanted to adopt a child and you couldn't get a child in America, you could buy a baby in Ireland, basically. You just went and you gave the nuns a large chunk of money and they gave you a baby. And a lot of these babies' names were altered and their backgrounds were altered. So there's still people in America kind of just struggling with the discovery that actually, you know, they're Irish babies, they didn't know. My point anyway is you have, you know, why do you have to go to those extremes? You have to go to those extremes because actually Irish people are just like everybody else. You know, they're not exceptional, they're not saintly, they're not holy. They're just getting on with their lives like everybody else is. And you know, one of the reasons, of course, why young women emigrated in such large numbers was because they didn't want to live that life. You know, they wanted options that were different. And so this holiness, this sort of hyper-Catholicism had to be maintained at a fearful cost. And of course, at the cost of sin. These institutions were profoundly sinful, you know, by any religious standards. You know, what was being done to vulnerable, defenseless people was horrific. And that was the worm in the apple, you know. That was working its way through very, very, very slowly. But this is one of the things that would explode at the end of the 20th century, which was confrontation with all of that history. But that confrontation, again, was very, very interesting because as a journalist, you know, you're sort of programmed to think about revelation. You know, people, this is hidden away and you don't know about it. I'm going to show you the reality. These things were up front, they were there. You know, laundries, you know, people were using these laundries that were run by slave labor of women whose rights had been taken away and had just been incarcerated. The last Magdalen laundry closed in 1994 in Dublin. And it's not, you know, on some island off the west coast. You know, it's, if anybody knows Dublin, I mean, what's regarded as the centre of Dublin would be O'Connell Bridge across the river. This is a 7-8 minutes walk from O'Connell Bridge. You know, these are huge institutions. So, I mean, hence in part my title, you know, about we have to decide not to know all that. Right? So this is the kind of doubleness, the collusion that goes on, you know, and then the shock at the end of the 20th century when a couple of very brilliant journalists, my friend Mary Raftery, dearly departed, unfortunately, but Mary was the one who really broke the silence and did a series of 4 films for RTE about the industrial schools. That was the first thing. And it needed somebody to sit with the people who knew stories. Of course, it were the people who had actually been incarcerated. You know, it was the victims, knew the story. Nobody would listen to them. Nobody would trust them. You know, it's very easy to create a narrative in Ireland. Well, you know, they must have been up to something. And particularly women who were incarcerated in Anglophone as well, they must have been sexually promiscuous, or maybe they were prostitutes, or who knows what they were. You know, all that kind of whispering around the place had sort of meant that very large numbers of people's stories simply could not be told. And the third part of this then, so this is the kind of fusion of nationalism and Catholicism. The third bit of this was to do with nationalism and a sort of version of it, which I tried to kind of describe in the book as well. You know, my childhood was saturated in ideas of martyrdom, you know, national martyrdom, that actually the best thing you could possibly be was to die for Ireland. But the interesting thing is that by the time I was 8 years old in 1966, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, which was the kind of sacred moment of Irish nationalism. It had all become a bit of a joke, you know, not a joke, but it sort of this kind of, it become unreal, you know. So there was all the emotion, all the songs, all the playing out of this stuff, but everybody thought it was over. It was in the past. Northern Ireland was up there. You know, the Prime Minister at the time, Sean Lemass, who was a veteran of the 1916 Rising, these people were still running the country. But Lemass had kind of reached out and gone up to the north and, you know, made friendly overtures and said, look, you know, we can sort all this out. The idea that there was going to be a violent conflict, it was just absurd. You know, the IRA was, insofar as it still existed at all, was a joke, actually. And you know, its heroic deeds were kind of celebrated because they were over. It wasn't going to return. And then the doubleness of that was, you know, this kind of valorization of violence, valorization of the idea of kind of dying for Ireland, killing for Ireland. But, you know, it was all in sort of quotation marks as sort of performative, you know, acting out something that was never going to really have to happen. So, you know, we put on concerts in 1966 with, you know, waving the flag and doing that kind of very, you know, nationalistic stuff, but it didn't mean anything. And then, of course, it starts to mean something, right? Then the shock is that some young people took it seriously, that the IRA comes back, you know, that the conflict in Northern Ireland starts. And then you have this kind of real kind of slow, difficult confrontation with, was all of that rhetoric, did we mean it? Because if we did mean it, we've got to go and invade Northern Ireland and have a civil war. And if we didn't mean it, we've got to start pulling back from it somehow and saying, actually, maybe killing and dying for Ireland isn't maybe such a good idea. And a sort of doubleness continues for a very long time as well. So you have these kind of three things where you have alternate realities, as it were, around demography, like who physically are we, what's the Irish people, around religion, that's kind of hyper attached to our identity, but we're also kind of, we become very adept at moving around it. One of the examples I give and I relish really is, just giving examples. So in the 1970s, by the 70s, with kind of modernization, you still can't, the pill is still illegal. You know, you can't have it. However, there's a strange medical anomaly, which is that Irish women are the worst women in the world at controlling their periods. They have more menstrual problems than anybody else ever recorded in the entire history of medicine. And some foreign people are saying, something really weird going on in Ireland. Of course, what's going on in Ireland is that the pill could be prescribed as a cycle regulator. So you could go to your doctor and you say, I'm having real trouble, you know, controlling my menstrual cycle. And you say, oh, well, there is this thing you could use. Now, it has another function. Of course, you wouldn't use it for that, would you? And you would say, oh, no, doctor, I certainly would not. You know, and then he would write a prescription, and you would go to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist would say, now you know this is a cycle regulator. It's not, I'm not giving you a contraceptive. And you would say, yes, absolutely, I know that, of course, doctor. You know. And the entire education system and the entire health system would have collapsed if people were not very adept at this kind of lying. You know, because women were more and more, you know, teachers, for example, so in the education system, which was expanding, nurses, you know, if they were having a baby every year, as they were supposed to be, if they were married, you know, they would all be permanently out on maternity leave, you know. So the church, of course, all these institutions were run by the church. The church was running the schools, which had the women who had to be not having babies, and running the hospitals, who had the nurses who had to be not having babies. But contraceptives were illegal, and they were kind of hoping somehow that the people would lie about it and get around it. We became brilliant at that. I use the phrase in the book, Connie dodging. And this is a phrase that came from Cork. So in Cork, there was a notoriously strict bishop. He was called Cornelius Lucy, and he was referred to by the populace as Connie, you know, after kind of shortening his name, Cornelius to Connie. And Connie insisted that the church rule was on Good Friday, which of course will be tomorrow, you're not allowed to eat, or actually during Lent, sorry, not just Good Friday at the time, during the whole of Lent, which is 40 days, you were only allowed to eat one meal a day, but you could have two what were called collations, which were like, it was meant to be like a little biscuit, something like that, a tiny thing. So a baker a woman baker in Cork baked these huge biscuits that size, and they were called Connie Dodgers, you know, because you were strictly within the rules. You know, it was a biscuit. You know, it wasn't. You weren't committing sin, but you were stuffing your face with. So it's this kind of brilliant kind of attitude, this evasive way of dealing with things, and you only develop this if you don't think the power system's going to change. If you think you can change it, you just say, I'm going to defy it. I'm going to be openly defiant. And some people were, like those fantastic women in the Irish women's liberation movement. You know, but most of the population, what you do is you kind of develop ways of, you know, the cycle regulator or the Connie Dodger, or, you know, getting around things, including, of course, abortion. So abortion was punishable in Ireland up to relatively recently by life imprisonment. But you went to England, you know, didn't tell anybody. You know, hundreds of thousands of Irish women went to England over that period, and came back, you know, after a brief holiday. You know, so all these ways of getting around things really was the way the society worked. And that, I think, is why, in the end, this system collapses so quickly, which is that, in a way, it's just becoming, over time, as the society becomes more and more an urban, educated, sophisticated, globalized society, it's just getting to the point where all of those things have to be just they gradually kind of shift, the ground shifts so that they are becoming the norm. And then the whole thing the whole superstructure that was built on top of a really kind of false version of what Ireland was like really collapses, and it collapses very dramatically in the 21st century, to the point at which, I mean, it is quite extraordinary. I mean, maybe just to finish, like, who would have predicted, you know, when I was born in 1958, that the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage by popular vote, I mean, not by a court or by parliament, but popular vote, to legalize same-sex marriage was Ireland in 2015. And it was done by 2-1. You know, there was a real national consensus around this. And, you know, it just, if you were a conservative Catholic, you were probably just looking around and saying, what is this place? How did it become like this? You know, but there was a sense, of course, in which it had always been like that. And that's essentially the story that I try to tell. Yes, please.
Just, if you don't mind, give me a second to come to you with the mic so that everyone can hear you clearly, and including people online.
Fintan, I wonder if you will reflect on the kind of collective psyche of the people who left.
Yeah.
Because there's clearly a big connection still between the people who left and the people they might have left behind, or just the country itself.
So this is a huge generalization, but I think the people who left for England and Scotland were much more bitter about Ireland. I think because that experience of, you know, going back to the kind of colonial motherland, supposedly, and also they tended to be poorer. You know, they tended to be less economically successful than the people who came to America. And that's a huge generalization. But in America, the Irish were, and well, became, I suppose, you know, over time, a more privileged, successful part of the society. So they tended, oddly, to have kind of more nostalgia, I think, about Ireland itself. Although there's some great literature. I mean, there's like a wonderful book by Alice McDermott, a wonderful novelist called Charming Billy, which is about an Irish woman who marries a guy back in Ireland and goes back, and it's very bitter. I mean, it's really full of rage and all that. So I'm not saying there's none of that, but by and large, I think you got this kind of strange sort of collusiveness really between Ireland and Irish America, where Ireland told Irish Americans what they thought they wanted to hear, and Irish Americans agreed to believe it. You know, and you know, and it was actually not a healthy relationship, because a lot of it was about. I write a lot about Kennedy's visit to Ireland in 1963. Is kind of extraordinary. You know, I describe, and I don't think any other Irish person has really described it, because it's very shameful. Like, Kennedy was mobbed at the official government reception for him. they nearly knocked him down. They were crying, they couldn't, the icon of this Irish American success, of course. And then Kennedy says things in his speeches like, I mean, I don't know if he knew what he was doing, but, like he goes back to his home place, New Ross, like, not a pretty run down town then. And he's kind of saying, if I hadn't left here, I could be working over there in the fertilizer factory, And the guy working in the fertilizer factory is probably saying, yeah, maybe if I'd left, I'd be you. Yeah, I don't think whatever. So it's all this kind of stuff about, this strange kind of relationship. Oddly enough, and people may think this is kind of ridiculous, but I think one of the healing things about the relationship with Ireland and South America is Riverdance.
Yes.
Wow.
And that might seem kind of weird, but remember, Riverdance takes an Irish form which had become kind of laughed at in Ireland, which was Irish dance. Nobody wanted to be an Irish dancer. Well, I know some people were forced to, but it wasn't glamorous, shall we say? And it just brilliantly took this thing. But the original dancers in Riverdance were Americans. They were Irish Americans. They were from Chicago and New York. The style of Riverdance was taking Irish dance and kind of making it Broadway. It's kind of fusion, a beautiful fusion of the Irish thing and the American thing. And it started to make complete sense because actually, where does Broadway dance come from? Well, you go down Broadway, you see the statue of George M. Cohan. I have to admit, when I went there first, I thought, well, Cohan, he must be Jewish. He was actually Kyohan. They were Irish. I mean, he was an Irish dancer, originally. He learned, his father was a piper, a traditional piper, and they used to perform as a family, in New York, and then he invents really invents Broadway by, of course, integrating African American tap with Irish dancing and kind of creates this thing. So there's a kind of sense of it coming back home in actually a rather beautiful way, And you can mock the Riverdance thing in some way, but at that time it just felt like actually this is okay, this is kind of some sort of reconciliation of all things.
Your closing comments about the passing of the gay rights initiative and bringing gay marriage to Ireland in that small country. I've often wondered about the power of the plebiscite that's used in Ireland, where the people are speaking.
Yeah.
And you by the votes. And in any way, do you think that has hastened this tremendous New Ireland, whatever you want to call it? I mean, that the people, you just don't mess with them now. They're not gullible.
Yeah.
They're just not gullible. And things that the government and the church, McQuaid and De Valera combo, they were able to, pull off so many things that you just can't do today.
Yeah. I think it's true. Progressive people tend to be very suspicious of plebiscites because, of course, they can be used historically. They've been used in all sorts of horrific ways by Hitler and other people. And you think they can be manipulated. And I suppose you need a plebiscite within a very firm framework of human rights, right? So you can't have a plebiscite on whether or not you're a human being, or you're going to be accepted as an equal citizen. So it has to be within those boundaries. But the fact that we were forced to have a plebiscite in Ireland, so the reason there had to be a referendum on same-sex marriage was because the Constitution was written in the 1930s. It's very much a Catholic constitution. It's very much about the marriage based on, or the family based on marriage. And this has been interpreted by the courts to mean, opposite sex marriage. So the Parliament couldn't do it on its own. It had to go to a referendum. And so I remember feeling kind of actually a bit, ambivalent about this. I thought, people have a right to equal dignity, whether people like it or not. It's not a majority vote issue in some ways, but the fact that we had to have it meant it was actually a beautiful time, because it meant that how is this going to be done? And it was done. It was one of the best political campaigns I've ever seen anywhere. It was done by telling stories, and by telling stories of some people going on TV or whatever saying, I'm a gay woman, I'm a gay man, I'm your brother, I'm your sister, I'm your friend, I'm your, I live down the road from you, I'm not some other category of humanity, and just appearing. You know, it was all about just appearing. And actually, the things that what was beautiful about it was that it turned the nastiest thing about Irish society, which was the overwhelming claustrophobia, you know, of people watching, you know, that young woman, she should be taken off to Magdalene laundry, you know, it's just kind of that sort of surveillance idea of the gossip. It turned it on its head and made it a beautiful thing, which was, yeah, I do know you actually, you know, it became intimacy, and intimacy is a very different thing. You can't discriminate against people when you know them, you know, when they're human beings, you know, when you look them in the eye and you think, yeah, that's, you know, that's just, so it did turn out to be actually a rather lovely thing. I remember hearing there were two votes on the same day. One was about a kind of technical issue about the age at which you could become president, not a very important one, and the other one was about the same-sex marriage, which was the big one. So there were two ballot papers. We still use ballot papers, which I think is a very good idea, by the way. They can't be interfered with by Russia or everybody else, you know. Physical ballot papers, you mark them, and then they're counted physically, you know. But anyway, there were two ballot papers. One was green and one was white. I remember, I knew the thing was going to be passed, so I went down to vote, and there were two very elderly ladies, and one was saying to the other, "What are the two papers for?" You know, it was supposed to be a secret ballot. She said, "What are the two papers for?" And one said, "One is for the gays and the other is for the lesbians." Okay, we're home and dry here.
Given the remarkable and rapid transformation of Ireland that's occurred in your lifetime, and now given the reality of Brexit, where does that take Ireland with respect to Northern Ireland?
It's a great question. You know, I would always have said that I didn't think I would live to see a united Ireland, you know, the two parts of Ireland becoming one state. That is still perfectly possible. I won't. I could drop dead tomorrow, because, you know, but if I were to live in, you know, a sort of good lifespan into my 80s, I wouldn't be too sure I won't see it. And this is not necessarily even arguing about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, you know, because you're absolutely right to identify Brexit as the driver. And this is a bit scary, right? You know, for all of my lifetime, whether you wanted a united Ireland now or you wanted it in the future or you desperately didn't want it at all, it was an Irish question. It was about us on the island, you know, Protestants, Catholic, Unionist, Nationalists, having to find some way forward. And Brexit says, actually, maybe this is not your story after all. Maybe what's going to happen is the United Kingdom's going to break up. And if the United Kingdom breaks up, what are you united to if you're a unionist? You know, what happens if Scotland becomes independent in the next 10 years, which is not impossible by any means. But also what Brexit showed us was actually that we'd kind of forgotten about English nationalism, you know. I had an image in my head around the Brexit time that there was a kind of fixed amount of crazy nationalistic neurosis on the two islands, that as it had gone down in Ireland, this went up on the other one, you know. And it was actually really rather strange being the Irish person, you know, who was saying, actually, guys, you know, we've done all that stuff, we've done all the crazy nationalism, and it's not a great idea, really. You know, we kind of know what it's like and where it leads. You have to have a much more sophisticated sense of belonging. You know, and so while we were putting into our constitution, we changed our constitution in 1998 to actually come up with, I think, a very beautiful formula for thinking about Irish unity. It used to be an old-fashioned 19th century thing. That bit is our territory, we want it back. You know, that was the kind of classic nationalism. And it was changed in 1998 by popular vote, by a vote, and again, of more than 90% of the people, to say it is the aspiration of the Irish people, it is the aspiration of the Irish people to unite in harmony and friendship. The people who share the territory of the island of Ireland in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. And I think it's a rather beautiful way of thinking about what unity might mean. It can't mean, you know, going back to some sort of monolithic identity. The way I always put it is it can't be, you know, taking one and one, and instead of getting two, getting one. You know, it has to be taking one and one and getting three or four or five or six. You know, actually opening up the idea that that Ireland could be a space of multiple identity. The second most commonly spoken language in the Republic of Ireland now is Polish. We're going to bring in 100,000 Ukrainians, which is a lot of people in a small place. You know, maybe 200,000. Who knows? 17% of people who live in the Republic of Ireland now were born elsewhere. Of course, Ireland being Ireland, 17% of Irish people also live elsewhere. So the indigenous people, we still go away, but other people come to Ireland. You know, so it's become a very open, globalized, mixed, cosmopolitan kind of place. So we might be stuck with this thing of having to find a way to unify. My fear is that we try to do it too quickly and we try to do it without preparation, because those kind of chaotic situations in a society, in Northern Ireland is still not reconciled, right? It's still not fully dealt with. You know, there's a lot of anger and bitterness and division. So you don't want to do this too quickly. But I think it's a conversation we need to be trying to have, right? About what would it look like? What kind of place would it be?
So really, just backtracking from Unity for a second, Deborah Capel is asking, inviting you to reflect a little bit more on the Troubles and from 1960 to 98 and how they fit into this narrative.
Yeah. Thanks very much for the question. So I tried to tell the story, which has been very shocking to a lot of Irish people, because I would have been known as a kind of critic of the IRA and of the violence. I tell a story about me kind of shouting up the IRA myself, you know, as a 14-year-old kid at the Prime Minister's Taoiseach, you know. And, you know, try to describe just how much we were in the South, you know, we were part of the narrative. I thought it was the kind of martyrology and time for our lives. It was kind of, the place was saturated in this stuff. And for me, you know, it became real. And I remember vividly the night it became real. And it was a night when loyalists, loyalist paramilitaries, planted a bomb in Dublin. And the bomb was planted in a little side street off O'Connell Street, the main drag. It was called Sackville Place, but Sackville Place was like there was nothing there except the canteen for the men who worked on the buses. My father worked on the buses. He ate in that canteen every day. And this was a time before, like, obviously before mobile phones, but also, you know, working class people didn't even have a landline. You know, we didn't have a phone. Nobody around had a phone. So it came on the news, you know, that there had been a bomb, and they thought that two men had been killed. You know, and we just said they're definitely bus conductors or bus drivers. You know, there's the only people who would be right there would be them. It turned out this was true. But I just remember, you know, as a kid, that sort of, it was a couple of hours of sitting at home, you know, and we couldn't contact my father, we didn't know what was happening. I still remember to this day the key in the door, you know, the joy, that ordinary, very ordinary sounds, you know, key in the door. You wouldn't even hear it usually, but you'd say, listen. I meant he was going home, he was home, you know, and he didn't even know what happened. He'd been out, you know, on a bus somewhere, he could just come back. But it made me think about violence, you know, and I think it made a lot of people think about violence. And what happened really was that, by and large, the Republic, Southern Ireland, kind of withdrew from the North. This was not noble. It wasn't, you know, something at all ideal. A lot of it was just kind of, again, let's pretend we don't know. You know? And remember, you're talking about like 60 miles from Dublin up to Northern Ireland. You know, it's not like, in American terms, it's nothing. You know, you guys would go to dinner and come back. You know, but you know, another mental curtain of saying that's up there. We want to keep it up there and not down here. But actually, that then had a kind of long-term effect, which meant that the IRA couldn't win. So the IRA strategy to win was all based on the fact that you needed the entire nationalist population behind you. And in fact, the vast majority of the nationalist population of the Republic, for noble or ignoble reasons, you know, was kind of saying, well, actually, we don't want to know. We're not getting involved. So it did have a big effect on the way the Troubles ultimately played out. The only good thing you can say for the doubleness, this sort of double mentality that I've been criticizing a lot and stuff, it actually helped a lot in the peace process. Because the peace process meant trying to find words and ambiguity enough that you could say, this means, you know, if you're a unionist, you could read this a certain way, and if you're a nationalist, you could read it another way, and you could find the thing that you liked in these formulas of words. So all this kind of doubleness, the great phrase in the Belfast Agreement, and I don't think there's anything like it again in international law that I know of, you know, where it says, it is the birthright of everyone in Northern Ireland to be Irish or British or both, as they may so choose. And that's an or both. Those 6 letters are fantastic. And they're very Irish, as I've been saying.
Lovely. I'm going to come around. Do you still have a question?
Sure.
Oh,
Yeah,
you've answered everything, thank you.
Was that you're done? No.
Oh, he's finished everything for me, yes.
Maybe I'll ask one question if there isn't another one.
That brings up, and gentleman here has questions.
Then yours will be the last question.
I'm going to take the troubles a little bit further. We were in Ireland about 20 years ago, and when we went to the pubs, we were told by younger people the troubles. So that was my grandfather, that was my grandmother. We're all happy here. This is in Belfast.
Would you speak into the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. So that was in Belfast. We were there 2.5 years ago, about time of day, and went to some of these same pubs and stuff. And they said maybe it was Brexit or some other stuff. They were worried the troubles were going to return. We spent some time in Derry. The Bloody Sunday was still on everybody's mind. We were only 2 blocks from where it happened. We met the brother of one of the victims. And we've been concerned ever since then that something may go wrong.
I think you put it very well. I don't think the troubles are coming back, on the scale or the depth or the duration that they had horrifically between 68 and 98, Nobody thought that was going to happen then, and I don't think it's going to happen again. But you're absolutely right to say that you can't be complacent about this, because Brexit has really what Brexit showed is the British government, and particularly the Tory party, dominates British politics, really doesn't give a damn, just doesn't care at all about any of this. It played no part at all in their discourse about Brexit, the border, the implications for Northern Ireland. And Brexit's played out now in a way which is sort of detaching Northern Ireland from Britain economically. Northern Ireland is now effectively staying within the European Union in terms of the single market and the customs union. So economically, it's increasingly part of the island of Ireland and of the European Union, whereas the rest of Britain's going in another direction. So it's very deeply destabilizing. And it brings up the existential question. So the reason people would say to you 20 years ago it's all over is the whole peace process was about saying, let's not talk about where does this end up. Let's just talk about getting on with life now. And then we'll see where we are in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. That was the general attitude, I think. But the Brexit thing is so irresponsible because it sort of raises all these existential questions. Are you Irish? Are you British? Are you, what's the future? Do you want to unite Ireland? Do you not want to unite Ireland? It's been really, really detrimental along those lines. And there's always we know, look at what happened in the New York subway the other day. We know that a very small number of people can cause terrible violence, if they're determined to do it, they can do it. I do think, however, just to be slightly optimistic, the evidence suggests that there is increasingly a third identity in Northern Ireland. So the binary thing, particularly with young people, more and more young people in the polling, and it's a very polled place. There's a lot of constant studies of this. More and more young people are saying, they're asked, are you a unionist or a nationalist? Saying, no, neither. I'm not doing that. I don't want to play that game. They're looking for, identities around the environmental catastrophe, around feminism, around, a whole set of other issues of global justice that they're interested in. They don't want to be locked into this thing, Yeats has that great line, we are locked in and the key is turned on our uncertainty. And I think, a lot of younger people in Northern Ireland are just fed up with being locked in, they just don't. I don't like using sport as a because it's such a weird parallel universe, but something like Rory McIlroy, for example, is very interesting as a young Northern Ireland person, the golfer, who has had no problem at all, moving around. He represented Ireland in the Olympics, but he's also very happy to, if somebody says he's British, he doesn't go crazy or anything, he's perfectly happy to live in both worlds and move around. And this is what makes me so angry about Brexit. That was what was happening naturally, because that's what people do. If you take conflict and violence out of the situation, people get on with life. We were just talking about this, before the Troubles started in '68, there was enormous numbers of people were marrying across the sectarian divide. You know, it was just natural. And I was just saying, like, well, one of the things that was going on was rock music, pop music. You know, Van Morrison, you know, playing in the local club. So all the young people are going to the same clubs, and you know, you don't look at a boy or a girl across the room and think, I wonder, is she Protestant? You know, you say, oh, I like that. You know, and you know, you dance, and then before you know it, you're married. You know, and that was happening. It was happening. You know, this was the way that kind of life was going, and it's the way it's been going really over the last 20 years. So an awful lot of people. This is why the border issue became such a problem in Brexit. An awful lot of people now live on one side of the border and work on the other side, or go to school on the other side, or you know, people just get on with life, and because you see the conditions that created partition 100 years ago are by and large gone. The conditions were, like, if I was a Protestant in Belfast in 1920, I might have said, I actually don't want to be part of a Catholic church-dominated nationalist Ireland. Why? Because I'm in one of the most sophisticated industrial cities in the world, which Belfast was at the time. I'm doing shipbuilding. You know, they're doing, you know, cattle raising. We're not compatible here. You know, religious difference was huge. Urban-rural difference. I mean, you know, Northern Ireland is different because it was very urban, whereas the rest of Ireland was very rural. All those kind of things. All of those are gone. They're all changed. I mean, the Republic of Ireland is now more technologically advanced and sophisticated than Northern Ireland is. It's no longer a Catholic state in that sense at all. And it's a majority urban society. It's now one of the, I think it's arguably the best educated society in Europe. You know, well over half of the age cohort has third level qualifications. You know, it's a completely different kind of society than it was 100 years ago. So this binary just doesn't really work anymore. And so when you remove those binaries, you know, people are they're all Irish people. They're all very similar. I mean, that doesn't necessarily, I mean, Russians and Ukrainians are very similar, you know, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't get what Sigmund Freud called this narcissism of small difference. But I think the room for that has just narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, you know, and certainly among younger people, they're just tired of that game. They don't play it anymore.
Well, that vision of flexible, multiple identities built around the problems we have to solve collectively is certainly one that we could use a large dose of here as well. What a nice place to pause or end. There's much more to say. Take your questions to this amazing book, and you'll find many, many answers. And before we thank Fintan, I just want to say that if you do want to buy a book, will you have time to sign?
Yes, sure.
Just bring it up, and then you can pay on your way out. But now, please join me in thanking Fintan.